In today's video, we are going to be talking about symptoms, diagnosis, and then tips on changing the brake booster out in your Toyota 4Runner. Now, I first noticed that I had a braking issue when I hadn't driven the vehicle for 2 weeks. Went to go and get dinner with my brother and noticed that I had no power brakes as I was going around a turn. So I thought, this is kind of odd. When I got in the car, I had them. So I pulled off, ran through all the gears, brake pedal felt fine. It wasn't until I got home later on that evening and I was backing up the 4Runner that I noticed once again I didn't have any power brakes. I thought this was weird, and the research began. So now, as I was doing my research, I found a few common issues that it could be. So the brake booster check valve being number one, then we have the brake booster itself, the master cylinder. There could be a vacuum line that has a tear in it, or it's leaking, it's fallen off. And so as the days went on, my brakes were getting a little bit worse each day. I was getting less and less power assist. So I thought, let's go ahead and check out the brake booster check valve. And so I pulled it out of the booster, and you can hear all the vacuum pressure leak out as you pull this out. And I just wanted to inspect it to see if there was any noticeable issues, none that I could really see. But when I put it back in and I fired up the car, once again, I now had no power brakes whatsoever. So any assist that I had before, even if it was 50% of the time, I now did not have it at all. So that made me think, well, it's probably not the check valve, it's probably the booster itself. Now you can also do the test of putting your foot on the brake when the car is off, turn the car on, and your foot should sink down as that booster does its job. And that was not the case for me. So then I pretty much chalked it up to a bad booster. So now that I've determined that it is a booster, went ahead, did some more research, understood kind of what my options were. You can either go in aftermarket, those are a lot cheaper than the OEM, or even some of the higher name brand boosters that are on the market. And I did this because the vehicle's not really worth a whole lot at the end of the day, unfortunately, so I couldn't bring myself to spend $600, $800 on an OEM booster. So I went with an aftermarket booster, it's about $90, and went through that install process. Now, if you go on any forums, you'll most likely find that the job is pretty straightforward from everybody who does it. But I'm here to give you some tips after I have now gone through the job, and I didn't think it was as straightforward as it seemed on the forums. So, number one, make sure, and this is for any job, make sure you have all of your tools, all of the equipment you need beforehand. Last thing you want to do is dig into this job and then realize that you need a special tool. In this job, not the case, or you need an additional part. So have all your tools. Next up is have a second set of hands. It really helps when it comes to pulling that booster out and pivoting the master cylinder out of the way. Now, when you go to pull the brake booster out, what you'll find, so it'll sit, firewall will be right here, and this will be the engine bay right here. So on this rod, you're going to have your pickle fork that sticks out. I would recommend, if possible, to pull that pickle fork off whenever the original booster is still in there. So there's going to be a nut and then your pickle fork, and you just have to crack them opposite directions and you can pull that pickle fork off. And the reason being is it sticks off probably about 1.5 to 2 inches. And what ends up happening is as you pull this brake booster forward to make sure all of this comes out of the firewall, that your master cylinder on the other side has to move that far, pivot that far in the engine bay itself. So if you reduce the overall length of material that you're pulling through the firewall, the less that those hard lines coming off the master cylinder have to flex and maneuver around. Now, talking on the master cylinder, do try and break off or loosen some of those additional 10 millimeters that hold the clips or the clips that hold the hard lines to the firewall on the back, on the back side. That's going to give you just a little bit more leeway, reduce that risk of kinking any lines just a little bit more. Now, when it comes to putting the brake booster, your new brake booster, back in, first thing, have a second set of hands in order to help pull that master cylinder out so you're not having to push it out of the way with the booster while trying to finagle it down into the firewall. Second thing, and I mentioned this in the booster replacement video, I said to leave the pickle fork off for the same reason when you're taking it out, and that you don't have to move the master cylinder as far out of the way. Now, I did mess up there a little bit in the sense that I put it all the way down, started tightening everything back to the firewall, and then realized that my brake pedal was now in line with this rod, and it was not possible to then put the pickle fork on. Because you're going to have interference from the brake pedal as everything connects. So it's better to push this down, get it in place to where this rod is just sticking through the firewall, and then put the pickle fork on. You're going to have enough clearance at that point to where you can screw it on. The only issue is trying to line up and measure the distance that original nut was away from the back side of the booster. Again, that's for the total play in the pedal. You can adjust it later if you need to. But anyway, I ran into an issue there, and I was then having to pivot the booster around in order to be able to screw on the pickle fork so it wasn't interfering with the brake pedal. So just another little tidbit there. Now, the final tip or item that I would consider purchasing before starting would be the brake pedal sensor switch. And here you can see what is left of mine. It is in fragments at this point. And this sensor switch is responsible for breaking the circuit to tell your taillights when to turn on and turn off. So when that little sensor switch broke into a million pieces, my brake lights were always on. And so what I had to do for the meantime was I had to put a penny in there and wrap it in duct tape to act as a sensor switch so that my brake lights, when my foot was off the brake pedal, would turn off. So again, this comes from just moving the brake pedal around while doing the job. I just so happened to hit it with enough pressure to where it broke that switch. Happens over time. It's plastic, it gets brittle, especially if you're in a hot environment. It's going through those heat cycles. So anyway, that's the last thing that I would consider purchasing prior to doing the job, so you don't have to buy it on the back end. But overall, the job is pretty straightforward. It took me about 3 hours to do. I know some people say they can do it in about 30 minutes. It's very impressive. I think I'm a little slower, but it took me about 3 hours. And it wasn't too difficult, but maybe a little bit more difficult than I was thinking before going into the job. So hopefully this video paired with the repair itself is beneficial to you guys and helps you when doing the job yourself. That's all I've got. I'll see you guys in the next one.